Hey everyone, I'm Ian Mitchell. Thank you for joining me here. I'm going to be talking about finding your superhero when fighting fraud leads to greater things. I'm a over 20-year fraud fighter in the industry. I was the head of fraud at a couple banks across over 30 countries. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you. Today, I'm going to be sharing some stories about my own transformation on how I've gone through my own journey related to fraud, really trying to explore how I can be a part of making the world a better place. And well, we'll get into that. But, I think in essence, this is one of the messages I want to land on here is together. It's really important in today's financial crimes climate to make sure that we are actively working together, not only as fraud fighters, but across cyber and AML. We need to make sure that we're working together to protect vulnerable populations, protect those that are being targeted from fraud. I would tell you, in 2019, I started this nonprofit called The Noble, and The Noble is K-N-O-B-L-E. The Noble's really mission is to protect vulnerable people, vulnerable populations from the adverse impacts of financial crimes. Vulnerable people defined, we call it actually human crime. It's human trafficking or modern slavery. 40 million people, it's estimated, 40 million people are in human trafficking. And this is an interesting stat. One person every 4 seconds is at risk. Financial crime, other types of financial crimes that attack not only elders and youth, but just general vulnerable peoples. Child exploitation is another just really, really critical one. It's funny, I've been a chance to, in the last couple of years, walk through some very real efforts around protecting vulnerable children online. It's a huge problem for us coming out of COVID. And then lastly, scams. And as fraud fighters, we all understand that the world of scams is the fight against scams is increasing exponentially. Levels of scams, fraudsters have realized that if they go after the weakest link, which is our customers, they're having more success committing fraud. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but those scams are actually linked to some of the worst evils in the world. So as part of the Noble, our goal is to unite financial crimes fighters together to protect those vulnerable people through networks. One of the important things we have, and this is an example of our sponsors and our partners at the Noble, we've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with some of the greatest organizations in the world, really to protect the vulnerable and really try to make the world a better place. Now, going to the stories, this is my story. I, like I said, I've been fighting fraud for over 20 years. I've had a real fortunate, blessed career. It's been amazing. But I would tell you, I went through it about 6 years ago. I was the head of fraud at a large regional bank in the United States. And I really I burned out. I like to say that I wore all the tread off my tires. I was basically done. And so I needed a change. And my change was as I moved to the mountains with my family in Tennessee, which was interesting for me because I'd lived in all big cities my whole life. I've lived in 5 countries and 13 states, all major cities. And I moved out to the middle of nowhere in rural United States. And I really found myself trying to understand the purpose along with growing a ridiculous beard. And I think the question is what would take somebody that had a very strong, great career in the corporate world and cause someone to move and give it all up? I quit. I was going to go work at a company called Walmart, shaking people's hands when they walk in. I was ready to do something completely different. And as you can see behind me, I have some guitars behind me. One of the things I did is focus a lot on my music. I write and record music. I really just wanted to do things completely differently. So what would cause this? Well, let me start by telling you a story. Appealing to the fraud fighters on the phone, I'm sure you've all been here. Having spent fighting fraud for over 20 years at card issuers and managing lots of credit card and debit card portfolios, I'm sure that this is a familiar topic. The issue of declining cards at the point of sale. I've been into many organizations where I go in there and they've had analytics organizations to detect fraud. But this particular institution that I went to really had a really small fraud team, mainly investigative, mainly responding, mainly just reacting to the actual fraud versus proactive. And one of the things I did is more than quadrupled, 4 times the size of employees I added. But the same I started adding more technology and infrastructure and also introducing the concept of using analytics. And I know this is not new for a lot of you, but this is interesting. So we were having a problem with our declines at the point of sale when people would swipe their cards. And the declines weren't a problem. The perception was that the declines, we were declining too many. But when I looked at benchmark in the industry, when I looked at benchmark myself in the industry, I realized that my decline rates were actually lower than most of my peers in the industry. The issue is what I was declining. We were doing very dumb, not very strategic or analytically driven declines. And so I remember after, on this transformational journey with this organization and really sending the message that we needed to invest in a consortium model and some machine learning analysts to actually start mining the data. I remember getting a note. I was coming back from my desk from being at another meeting, and I came back and a note very similar to this from the CEO of the bank, and basically said, "Ian, your fraud declines are out of control." What happened was one of the CEO's personal friends was declined at a point of sale at a grocery store for, I remember, $683 purchase at the grocery store. And again, for those that know grocery store purchasing and just cards, that's pretty anomalous. That's a pretty, I don't know, a high anomalous amount at a grocery store. The only thing is that this particular individual had done this multiple times, and that was actually a regular pattern. So this ended up being a situation where I used this as an opportunity to increase the investment and actually change our platform providers and actually move to a more traditional consortium-based risk scoring model. I say this story because there's a lot of infrastructure that's in place that we use on a daily basis as fraud fighters. We've been using consortium models for over 20 years in the form of FraudCON. On mortgages, we have solutions like CoreLogic in the US. Consortiums and sharing information to detect fraud is something we use all the time. We also use two-way text messaging, SMS messages, to contact customers if there's some high-risk behaviors. We've used analytics and machine learning for decades, building shade trees and other types of analytics. That infrastructure is foundational to how we fight fraud. Now, I want to get into some other stories. And remember, I'm talking about vulnerable populations here. What about if we use that infrastructure to protect people, maybe outside of some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis? My next story. I've been the head of fraud at a large consulting firm for a while now, and what we do is when a client maybe has a high risk event or has an event where they find an excessive amount of fraud, they would call a consulting firm and ask them to come in and help remediate, help solve that issue. Well, this particular client was a fintech, had just launched a new depository program in about 90 days. And in that 90 days period, they had some basic controls that weren't in place. And in that 90-day period, fraudsters just came through and caused a tremendous amount of damage related to the fraud losses. And so my team and I, we went in and we started helping them in multiple ways, including putting better rules in place, but also providing some resources to work alerts. So I had one particular analyst that basically came in from another client, and she had done a lot of work in compliance and BSA in addition to fraud. And she sat down and just was a couple days in, she started doing work at this client, working just debit card alerts. And she pulled me over, and this is after I started the Noble and was trying to find a new purpose fighting to protect vulnerable populations. She pulled me over and said, "Ian, I think we have a problem here." And what she had proceeded to lay out for me is that she saw one debit card linked to multiple hotel rooms, and they would also go to pharmacies, and just the patterns of shopping that she was seeing was indicative of something that she had seen before related to the trafficking of humans. And so it was amazing to me to be in a real life situation where an analyst who had seen a lot and experienced a lot with just some basic training and have experienced it more was able to identify some high risk behaviors. And we were able to escalate those, and it ended up reporting into turning into a suspicious activity report. And we ended up escalating that to the client and the compliance team. Truly, another really impactful story for me, just when it talks about what we can do, especially at all levels of fighting fraud. The third story I want to share is related to scams. When I was at my previous bank, one of my previous banks, I was really passionate about trying to help scam victims. What was happening when a customer was victimized of scam is we would identify the scam, let's say a romance scam, where they were thinking they had a boyfriend or a girlfriend in another country, and they would wire or send $10,000, $15,000 to this other country or to their significant other, convinced that it was a real person, clearly a romance scam. There are also work from home scams where some of our customers were looking for employment and they were be duped into depositing, pretending to set up a business and then depositing bad funds. I had that happen to personal friends of mine. Well, in this situation, I had been trying to revise how we were treating victims of scams for quite a while. We traditionally had, when somebody was victim of a scam, we would exit them from the bank, that we would try to help them remediate the situation, and then we would exit them and report them to a reporting agency that made it hard for them to open another bank account somewhere else. This is common practice, especially here in the United States, related to scams. And so what I was trying to do is demonstrate that if we remediated, if we actually kept them on books and educated them about scams, we actually would see them not only fix problems that they have and realize that maybe there was something that they were being duped into, but we would be able to restore and save that customer on the account or on the bank's books. And it was a very successful program, but I wasn't able to get the traction I wanted until I got a phone call coming into my office. My phone rang, and an SVP in our project management office called me and said, "Ian, I need your help here. My child coming out of college got an online job, and it was a work from home scheme." And what ended up happening is I didn't know about this until after this event. What happened was we, just like in the rest of our processes, realized that this person had been duped in this work from home scam, and we were in the process of exiting them from the bank, despite the fact that, of course, this was a child of a very successful employee of the bank. But it really opened the question as to why we're doing this. It's interesting. When I think about vulnerable populations, we a lot of times think of elders. We a lot of times think of elder abuse and elder scams, but we don't realize that at this point in our world, we're all vulnerable. I like to talk about the story when I was in college. I remember in university, there were credit card companies that would show up on campus and solicit college students. They would try to get them their first real credit card, to build a credit profile, and honestly build a new customer base there. And so the way they would entice college students to apply would be to either give a free t-shirt or a water bottle. And I love to say that when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I would do anything for a free t-shirt. And that's what we're finding right now. The fraudsters are not only preying on situations like COVID and the stimulus efforts, but they're also trying to go after vulnerable people that are situationally vulnerable, like youth. And so, and leveraging social media and such. And so at this point, we need to be viewing the lens, especially when it comes to scams, that we're all increasingly vulnerable. I get phone calls from chief risk officers that have become vulnerable, have become victims or targets of different types of scams. Other executives, well-educated people. I mean, it's amazing. This is right now, it's not just the traditional vulnerable populations you would think. Again, like I said, so we have to remember at the other end of all of our transactions related to fraud, and I take us back to my first two stories. The first one being about declining at a point of sale. Clearly, there's customer friction that happens there. My second story related to the detection of human trafficking and what ended up happening in that debit card transactions that was triggered by these fraud alerts. We have to remember at the other end of all these transactions are human beings, are people that are trying to have a life, trying to build a future, trying to support a parent or a child. So at the other end of all these transactions, when we think about doing our job as fraud fighters, we really can do a lot more related if we look at that lens of everyone is potentially vulnerable. So what are the 5 things when I talk to fraud fighters on a regular basis about the Noble and what can they do? I get a lot of phone calls, as you can imagine, about, okay, Ian, I'm aware of this human trafficking problem. You know, I see scams increasing. What can I do? Well, these are just 5 steps that I came up with, just simple things to do. It doesn't take a lot of investment. The first thing that I always recommend is define the problem. You have to recognize it's a problem before you're able to do something about it. And so just by having awareness, I showed to you what we define at the Noble as vulnerable. elder abuse, online exploitation of children, human trafficking, and all kinds of scams. There's people at the other end of these. Just by starting to create typologies, taxonomies, start classifying them into your program, second point, and case management systems. Start tagging them, recognize them. Don't just look for an account takeover or a fraud app or a counterfeit card or synthetic identity. When you see these things that are potentially suspicious, start grouping them, cataloging them, tracking them, put them in your program, into your prevention and your detection and your response efforts. Those are the first 2 points. The third thing, train your team. Just like that analyst had been trained in a prior engagement before she came to work with me at a client. If your team just understands the basics of what to look for, it goes a really long way. The fourth one, connect with other noble professionals. Connect with other people that are looking to make the world a better place in addition to their day job. And then work together. That's where I started. When you look at the environment we're in when we're fighting financial crime, the cyber team, an unbelievably powerful team of professionals in a discipline that's growing exponentially, where we're not just talking about network data, but just the whole nature of how much of our fraud on a daily basis is happening through digital channels, through the cyber channels. The amount of intelligence and information they have, it would make us all better if we interact with them in a healthy way, more proactively. The AML team, they've been doing customer risk scoring. They've been looking at intermediaries. They've been building programs to score transactions in ways that fraud teams haven't. If we can just start working with them and help, and not just help them solve compliance issues, but actually remember at the other end of the transactions are vulnerable people. If we start working closer to them, think about what we can do. Work together more proactively. Make sure that when you're coming together, you're not just coming to think about a problem or an effort in the same way that we have for decades in the world of fraud. It's not just an ATO. It's not just a counterfeit. It's not just synthetics. Again, there's people at the other end. So my last thing I want to share with you. So in my job at the Noble, again, founded the Noble, it's been an unbelievable ride. We're working with some of the top banks in the world. We have initiatives that are to detect online exploitation of children, to create red flags and standardize red flags or improve the red flags for human trafficking at financial services and institutions. We have law enforcement councils and working groups to really start raising the level of law enforcement, to get them to understand banking, and then candidly have bankers understand law enforcement, start creating common languages through our networks. Well, this is a case that I got through our Noble network. One branch of law enforcement, I had this hypothesis, basically. The hypothesis was that at the other end of our fraud transactions, when we see this money moving, they're not just trying to buy Lamborghinis or Rolls Royces or jet skis. They're likely moving money to an end point to actually be involved in committing the real evils of this world. The buying and selling of people, the buying and selling of drugs, the buying and selling of guns. That's the hypothesis. So I went and had some conversations with law enforcement. I was on over the last year and a half, what COVID did is really allow me to make connections in law enforcement. And I'm talking to all branches of law enforcement about this. And I found a part of law enforcement that echoed my hypothesis. And I'm still in this process of trying to get meaningful data, but they were telling me about a specific case. And this case was basically they were seeing scams, romance scams, business email compromise, all these happen at a multitude of banks. The numbers were in the 40s of banks that were involved in the scams. And they were seeing those monies aggregate down to a smaller number of banks. And so those monies were coming in, and then they were aggregating again at another bank in domestically United States. And then those monies were moving en masse overseas to a particular country where they linked them together with the trafficking of people and the trafficking of drugs. If that's not reason enough for us to start looking at our financial crime problem differently, I don't know what is. You see, we're in a unique part of time. We're in a unique environment where we have the data, we have the technology, we have some of the best skilled people on the planet showing up every day to do analytics, to work alerts, to work investigations, that if we actually train them and equip them, we actually can be a part of making the world a better place. I need to remind you this, if you take anything away from this is something I used to tell my team for years, because they struggled with this idea of, why do I do what I do? Why does what I do matter? We all have mortgages and car payments and just pay groceries. So why should I show up to work and work 8, 10, 12 hours a day? Well, I need you to know something. As it relates to banking, the most noble profession in banking is fighting fraud and financial crimes. Because at the other end of everything we do are real people, are your friends, are your children, are your parents. At the other end are your boyfriends and your girlfriends. At the other end are people that are just trying, just like you, to have a great life. So I want to thank you for what you do every day. I want you to know that what you do is truly making a difference in this world. I want you to please connect with us at The Noble. Figure out how you can jump in your day job to become more aware and bring these understandings and connect with other like-minded people so that when you go and show up every day, you understand how you can be a part of making this world better. Because inside all of us, I have a friend of mine named Matt Friedman that was part of my own awakening. He worked for the United Nations and has spent over 30 years fighting trafficking. He says, inside all of us is a superhero. Well, I believe that in my core. So inside of all of you, as you show up every day, please be aware that you're a part of making this world better. You truly are a part of making a difference, especially if you're mindful of it and you train your team. Thank you for what you're doing. You are a superhero in this world. I appreciate you. Thank you for investing your time with me and hopefully a couple stories, little bit to brighten your day and encourage you. Again, my name's Ian Mitchell, founder of The Noble. Thank you very much.